Hey, welcome to my Edpuzzle review video for the Royal Kingdom. We've made this journey through our timeline into different time periods, and each of these time periods have certain narrative books. Remember, there are 14 essential narrative books of the Bible out of the over 70 books. And so we're looking at the narrative books, and we've moved through something like 5 periods of history. We're arriving at in our last period, we arrived at the end where Saul is no longer fit to be king, and Samuel, the last judge and prophet, goes off looking for who to anoint as Messiah king. And so he arrives at the house of Jesse, and he anoints a young shepherd boy named David. And so let's begin the story. We want to look here at the color is going to be purple. It's the color of royalty. It's an expensive dye, and so we attach that to this period of history. It's essentially like the high point or of the Old Testament. King David is the high point of the Old Testament. He's the closest image we have to the coming true Messiah, Jesus. He is the closest image in the Old Testament to the kind of privileges that Adam had as a son of God, and he's the closest image in the Old Testament to what the assignment Adam and Eve had, that God was preparing them for, to go out into the whole world and to make the world like the garden, a meeting place for God and man. So the main narrative books for this period is First Samuel, Second Samuel, and First Kings, essentially the first half of First Kings. Um, we've had now 4 other covenants. This is our 5th covenant in the Old Testament. It's a covenant between God and David, the covenant mediator, and we move from Adam and Eve, who had a marriage covenant with God. Then we had Noah and his family, and the covenant grew bigger to include more people, and that covenant was a family covenant. And then we had um, with Abraham, a patriarchal covenant, a covenant with a tribe of people, with Abraham as the head of the covenant and over many families. And then the covenant grows even bigger in Moses, where those many families are now, those many tribes are gathered together, and there are 12 tribes of people, hundreds of thousands of people, with Moses as their leader. And when Moses brings them the commandments, we now have a national covenant, right? So we went from a marriage to a family to tribes to a nation. And now that nation gets a king, and they become a kingdom covenant. And so you can look at some of the additional books of the Bible, some of the supplemental books that fit in this time period: the book of Proverbs, Psalms, Chronicles, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Second Chronicles. Our three stories, we look at David killing Goliath as an image of what Jesus will do. We look at the Ark of the Covenant finally moving into the city of Jerusalem. Remember, while they were just traveling through the desert, they had a mobile temple. They called it the Ark. And inside the Ark were fragments of manna. There was part of the rod of Aaron, who was the high priest. That was Moses' brother. And they also had pieces of the Ten Commandments. And now that David is king, he makes the national capital the place where the temple will reside forever. And so they move the ark into Jerusalem. It's a huge event. And then they build the temple. And that begins with David, but it's fulfilled in David's son Solomon. Okay, let's just look at David's killing Goliath. So that it's kind of cut off here, but the title should be David Kills Goliath. Very quickly, though, we'll talk a little bit more in class, but my basic notes say this: the name David itself means beloved. So David means beloved. And so David is an image of Jesus. And when Israel is like being challenged by their enemies, the Philistines, they decide to do like a ritual combat, and they send their toughest soldier and who challenges the Israelite army in kind of combat, and whoever wins wins. And so instead of like wholesale massacre of both armies, you send your strongest warrior. And here comes the lumbering Goliath, and David comes as a young shepherd boy who's employed by the king as a minstrel, sees the whole army of Israel afraid. He decides that he'll challenge the giant. He refuses armor. He goes out with his sling and a set of 5 stones. Goliath kind of represents paganism, as David takes paganism down with what appears to be complete and utter weakness. And that's an image of Jesus bringing down kind of the kingdom of Satan, uh, not through strength, but through an image of weakness, through the cross. That the devil confronts Jesus with all the violence in the world. Instead of fighting back, Jesus receives that violence to himself, and it's neutralized, canceled out by love. And so on the cross is violence and love kind of meeting at the fulcrum of all human history. David uses 5 stones. David's a shepherd, a poet, and a king. But he's not passive and he's not wimpy. Um, and so like the story ends, and they don't really talk about it in cartoons, but David chops off the head of his enemy to show Israel um, that ultimately God is victorious. It's an image from a recent film, David, the Bible story that was filmed on like NBC or something. But this is just a quick image of David and King Saul. And that was a tenuous relationship. So let's talk about King David very quickly and his rise to becoming not just the anointed king, but the actual crowned king. He was anointed as a child, as a young man, by the prophet, but he did not sit on the throne and was crowned officially king until much later. Because even when he was anointed, King Saul um, was still the reigning king. And the plan was that when Saul stepped down, when his time was over, David would assume the throne as the anointed one, the Messiah. So let's talk about this. David served Saul as a musician and an armor bearer. Then we find out that David slays Goliath, and what begins to happen is that people begin singing songs about David, and he becomes the people's champ. And this kind of eats away at Saul, who begins to get jealous and envious that people love David. And that jealousy turns to envy, and envy begins to change Saul's whole worldview. Saul realizing that not only is God's favor not with King Saul, but now the people seem to be in love with David. And so Saul then begins this long assassination on David's life. And as David flees, some of the Psalms, the songbook or prayer book within the Bible, are composed by David, kind of calling out to God in the wilderness as he's fleeing from his king. It's really an interesting moment here. David, when he first flees, he finds refuge with another prophet. Then he flees to the hill country, and then later uh, has to go into a foreign nation and finds refuge there. He ends up as a leader of 400 men who are loyal to him at first. He even seeks aid from his best friend, which is Saul's son Jonathan. It's one of the cool stories in the Bible that are just like that. It's heart wrenching because we know later in this story that Jonathan dies and David is heartbroken because they become fast friends. Um, in one of these scenarios where Saul is pursuing after him, David and his smaller contingent of men sneak into Saul's encampment, and David has every opportunity to kill Saul, and he's justified in killing Saul, but he recognizes that God's favor was on Saul, and he respects Saul for the anointing that he has, even though he knows that Saul has been twisted and corrupted by his own pride. That David refuses to to speak against the authority that God gave Saul, and so instead he just kind of leaves a sign to Saul that David was here and he spared his life. And as of Saul receiving that as an act of kindness and mercy, it just infuriates Saul even more. Eventually, both Saul and Jonathan. Saul refusing to listen to warnings and advice. Eventually, they end up in another battle against the Philistines near Mount Gilboa, and in that battle, both he and his son are killed. And it's only then that around the age of 30, right? 30 is also an important number in the life of Jesus. That's when Jesus begins his ministry. Saul begins his ministry. But even then, it takes another 7.5 years of civil war between people still loyal to Saul and those who supported David before there's finally like a declaration of peace, and David reigns and is now crowned as king. All right, let's talk about the end of Saul's life, the Mad King. Um, so let's look at some key verses. Please make sure you write these Bible verses down. These are really important. 1 Samuel 10, verse 1. It says, Samuel took a flask of oil, Samuel is the prophet, poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance? This is the beginning of the blessing that Saul received and would have continued receiving had the words he spoken come from his heart and continued to penetrate his heart so that he would remain a faithful king. 1 Samuel 15. But Samuel replied, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? This goes into one of King Saul's betrayals that we talked about at the end of the last unit. And here Samuel's confronting him, trying to explain to Saul that God cares much more about his heart than he does about his wealth or what he's able to give God, as if God were like pagan gods who demanded stuff. So then Samuel goes on to say, To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like sin, is like the sin of divination. Divination is contacting the dead, as if like the dead could give you advice, or somehow it's like necromancy. But divination is like asking other spirits apart from God through some kind of barter system of stuff to give you insight into your future. It's similar to like fortune telling. So rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Later in Samuel, it says Saul was very angry. This is where people began proclaiming David as the people's champ. This refrain displeased him greatly. So this is the thing that irritated King Saul when David became very popular. People began singing these songs that had this verse in it. They have credited David with tens of thousands of victories. But with King Saul had his thousands, but David had his tens of thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. And then we look at the end of the life of Saul. He's now cornered. He knows that he will lose in battle. And he says these words. He says to his armor bearer, Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and abuse me. Meaning, if my enemies capture me as king of Israel, they're going to torture me, they're going to publicly humiliate me, they're going to use me as a way of leverage against my people, and he does not want to be put to shame. But his armor bearer was terrified and would not kill Saul. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it, meaning Saul committed suicide. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he was afraid, and then he killed himself as well. And on that day, Saul and his 3 sons, including Jonathan, his armor bearer, and all of Saul's men died together. And here's what the kingdom of David and Solomon looked like from a very general perspective. This was at the height of the kingdom of Israel in the amount of geography that it covered. So this is the kingdom of David now divided into 12 tribes of Israel, and each of these tribes are bartering for um, prominence and pride of place, and who's more powerful, more important, who's better defended. They're all kind of in union because they're a nation, there's still tension. And so David, realizing that he comes from a specific tribe, didn't want to play favorites, didn't want to pick a piece of territory that belonged to one of the tribes, lest other tribes see it as like a favoritism. So David finds himself in a war against the Jebusites, and he overcomes the city of Salem, which has not been conquered previously. And in doing so, um, you have Jerusalem becoming the capital and the place where the future temple will be built. Eventually, the northern tribes and the southern tribes would be divided, and this is what that division will eventually look like. Israel would be now no longer just the name for all of the people, all of the tribes. Israel will eventually be identified with just the 10 tribes in the north, and Judah would be identified as the 2 tribes in the south. Okay. Let's talk very quickly about the Ark of Jerusalem. When David took down the city of Salem and made it his national capital, one of his first actions was to move the Ark to Jerusalem. He made it his political and religious capital. And it's really cool if we read typologically, we can see that the ark is not just this object in the Old Testament, but it's foreshadowing something uh, more profound in the New Testament. And we will continue that in the second video. Thanks.